One day, the millionaire invited the cleaning lady to participate in an important negotiation. People were speechless when they realized what was happening. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, Emma began her shift in the bustling downtown office building where she worked as a cleaning woman. The glass windows of the skyscraper gleamed under the first rays of the day, but Emma didn't notice the beauty outside. Her focus was always inward on her tasks. With a mop in hand and a vacuum strapped to her back, she moved through the halls like a shadow, unnoticed by the men and women who hurried to their meetings and deadlines. She knew the layout of the building like the back of her hand, a map of polished floors, high-ceilinged hallways, and executive offices. The company was known for its luxury, a place where the rich and powerful gathered to shape the future, to ink deals worth millions. Emma had long accepted that she was merely part of the backdrop. She had no illusions about her place. Her life was one of routine, cleaning, dusting, sweeping, and polishing, all while remaining out of sight. It was always the same faces she saw, the top executives in tailored suits who marched to their own rhythms, with their briefcases and stern expressions. And then there was Mr. Thompson, Charles Thompson, the CEO of the company. He was a man of great power, always busy, always engaged in high-level negotiations, his presence commanding respect. He was a millionaire who owned properties, yachts, and a life most could only dream of. Emma had cleaned his office more times than she could count, but he never acknowledged her presence, never even gave her a second glance. To him, she was just the cleaning lady. To everyone else, too, she was invisible, a nameless figure who made sure the building stayed spotless. Yet, deep down, Emma carried a quiet pride in her work. She loved the order and cleanliness she created, even if no one else noticed. For Emma, the act of making the world around her better, one polished surface at a time, was enough. And so, her life went on, steady, predictable, and ordinary. But fate, as it often does, had other plans for her. Charles Thompson's world was a stark contrast to Emma's. Where she moved quietly through the shadows, he commanded the spotlight. His name was known far beyond the walls of his towering office building, synonymous with success, wealth, and influence. He dressed in perfectly tailored suits, his hair always meticulously styled, and his demeanor radiated the kind of confidence that made people sit up straighter when he entered a room. His days were consumed with high-stakes negotiations, mergers, and deals worth billions. As the CEO of one of the most successful firms in the country, Thompson's reputation had been built on decades of hard work, strategic moves, and an unyielding drive to succeed. He owned a fleet of luxury cars, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, and a yacht that glided through the waters of exclusive coastal resorts. He was the epitome of the American dream, his wealth a visible testament to his success. To his colleagues, he was a genius, a visionary, someone who knew how to make the impossible happen. They listened intently as he shared his ideas, eager to absorb his every word, to bask in his brilliance. And to his clients, both local and international, he was a man to be respected, feared even. In the high-rise offices where he held court, negotiations were rarely simple, and business deals rarely reached a conclusion without the kind of pressure and hard tactics that only someone like Thompson could wield. Emma never saw this side of him, of course. Her encounters with him were limited to cleaning the office spaces he left behind. As she swept the floors of his vast corner office, she would sometimes pause to look out the windows, imagining the life of luxury just beyond her reach. But as quickly as the thought crossed her mind, it was gone. She didn't belong to that world. She belonged to the quiet, unacknowledged background, where people like Mr. Thompson lived out their grandiose lives while she quietly cleaned up after them. And yet, somewhere beneath his polished exterior, Mr. Thompson had a problem that, in a strange twist of fate, might lead to an unexpected encounter between the worlds of the millionaire and the cleaning woman. Though Emma's life seemed simple and predictable, there was more to her than met the eye. It was easy for the executives in the building to overlook her, to dismiss her as just another nameless figure in a uniform, there to keep the place running smoothly. But Emma was far from ordinary. Beneath her quiet demeanor was a sharp mind, a quiet reservoir of untapped potential that few ever took the time to see. For years, Emma had kept her past hidden, a secret she had buried deep within. Before she became a cleaning woman, she had been highly educated, well-traveled, and fluent in several languages. One of those languages was the very one that Mr. Thompson and his team would soon find themselves struggling to understand, a language that could make or break the business deal that was fast approaching. But in the hallways and offices of the building, Emma's history was nothing more than a whisper of a forgotten past. She was a woman with a story that no one knew and skills that no one saw. Emma had come to the company years ago, hoping for a job that would allow her to support herself and her family. When she was younger, she had dreamed of being a translator, of using her linguistic skills to bridge gaps between cultures and people. But life had a way of pulling her in other directions. Personal tragedy had forced her to let go of those dreams. The job of cleaning the offices of wealthy businessmen became her reality, steady, if unremarkable. Yet, as she worked each day, Emma never forgot what she had learned. Her love of languages, her sharp mind for detail, and her ability to read between the lines. As she cleaned the glass conference rooms and polished the desks, she could overhear the foreign business discussions that echoed off the walls. She could understand every word, every nuance in their speech. And though she never let on to anyone, Emma knew that she had a rare skill. A skill that, if given the right moment, could change everything. The question was whether that moment would ever come. She had learned to be patient, to wait for the right opportunity. But in the days leading up to an important international meeting, Emma had no idea that the chance she had been waiting for was about to arrive, unexpectedly and in the most unlikely of ways. The tension in Mr. Thompson's office was palpable as the clock ticked down to the moment of truth. The meeting, scheduled for the following morning, was to be one of the most important negotiations of his career. A multi-million-dollar deal that would shape the future of his company and solidify his position as a leader in the industry. There was just one problem. His translator had canceled at the last minute. It wasn't just any translator. This was a highly skilled professional who had been booked for months to handle the delicate international negotiations. Without a translator fluent in the language of their foreign partners, the entire deal was at risk. Mr. Thompson's team had been working tirelessly for weeks, preparing the presentations, reviewing contracts, and gathering all the necessary documentation. But now, 1 hour before the meeting, they were left scrambling for a solution. "There's no one else available," one of his senior executives said, frustration lacing his voice. "We've contacted every agency. It's too late for anyone to come on short notice." Mr. Thompson's brow furrowed as he stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. He could hear the muffled voices of his team discussing alternatives, but his mind was focused on the looming disaster. The meeting was in a foreign language, a language that, despite his many years of success, he did not speak fluently. Without a translator, the deal would fall apart. The foreign partners would walk out, and their competition would swoop in, taking the opportunity away. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration building as his thoughts raced. The clock was ticking, and with every passing minute, the chances of salvaging the meeting grew slimmer. His team looked to him for a solution, but what could he do? There was no one available to step in on such short notice. His only hope now lay in a miracle, something that could pull them out of the fire at the last possible moment. In the silence that followed, a voice from the back of the room broke through the tension. "I think I can help." Emma had just finished cleaning the hallway when she heard the muffled voices from the conference room. The office was quiet, and the usual sounds of phone calls and distant chatter seemed to have faded away, replaced by an atmosphere of urgency. As she pushed her cleaning cart closer to the room, she noticed the door slightly ajar. It was an accident. Her curiosity had led her closer than she should have gone. But as she stopped in her tracks, she couldn't help but listen. She had always been attuned to the flow of conversation in the building, whether it was the chatter of the executives or the intense discussions that sometimes spilled into the hallway. But today, the voices were different. They were tense, fragmented. Words like urgent, translator, and meeting caught her attention. She leaned in a little closer, the sound of her cleaning cart scraping across the polished floor betraying her presence. She froze, praying no one would hear her. But it didn't matter. Mr. Thompson's voice, clear and commanding, cut through the conversation. "We can't afford to lose this deal. If we don't have a translator, this entire negotiation will be a disaster. We've got clients waiting, the contracts need signing. This is our chance to secure an exclusive deal with these partners. Without communication, we're dead in the water." Emma's pulse quickened. The deal he was referring to, the one everyone had been talking about for weeks, was important, not just for him, but for the entire company. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew enough to understand the gravity of the situation. Mr. Thompson's frustration was clear, and the desperation in the room was almost palpable. And then, a realization struck her. The foreign language they were dealing with, the one Mr. Thompson and his team couldn't decipher, was a language Emma knew fluently. She had spoken it all her life. It was one of the languages she had studied extensively before life had changed the course of her career. She could translate for them. Her heart raced. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to do something that mattered. But could she really step forward? Could she, a cleaning woman, offer her help in such a critical situation? She glanced at the conference room door, hesitation creeping in. She wasn't sure what she was about to do, but one thing was certain. This was a rare opportunity, one she couldn't afford to ignore. Emma stood there, heart pounding in her chest, her mind a whirlwind of uncertainty. Her cleaning cart, with its empty mop bucket and dusting cloths, seemed to weigh a ton in her hands. The minutes dragged by as she tried to make sense of what she had just overheard. She could help. She knew she could. But how could she possibly offer her assistance to Mr. Thompson and his high-powered team? She was just the cleaning lady, after all, an invisible figure in the background of their bustling world. Her hand hovered over the door, feeling the cool metal of the handle as if it might be the last thing keeping her from stepping into a world far beyond her station. The voices from inside continued, and she could hear the growing tension in Mr. Thompson's tone. "We've tried everything," one of his colleagues said. "If we don't have someone to handle the translation, we're going to lose everything." It was in that moment that Emma made a decision. She wasn't just the cleaning woman anymore. She wasn't the person who swept floors and emptied trash bins. She was someone with knowledge, with skills that no one had bothered to ask about. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and, with quiet resolve, pushed open the door. The room fell silent when she entered. The sharp, clean scent of the building clung to the air as the executives looked up from their heated discussion. Mr. Thompson was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture tense. He turned, clearly startled by the interruption. "Emma," he asked, his eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What is it?" She took a step forward, her voice steady despite the nerves swirling inside her. "I couldn't help but overhear. I know the language your meeting is in. I can help with the translation," she said, each word feeling more foreign than the one she was offering to speak. There was a moment of stunned silence in the room. Mr. Thompson blinked, clearly thrown off by the unexpected offer. His colleagues exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Emma stood there, feeling the weight of their gaze, some skeptical, others just confused. But she held her ground. "It's just that. I speak the language. I can help you with the negotiations," Emma added, her voice quieter now but no less determined. For a long second, the room remained frozen. Then, with a shake of his head, Mr. Thompson spoke. "This is unexpected, but I suppose you're the only option we've got." Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed as he studied Emma, unsure of what to make of her offer. The room was heavy with skepticism, the silence thick enough to make even the air feel taut. His colleagues exchanged glances, some openly questioning the idea, others trying to mask their doubt behind polite smiles. Emma felt the weight of their judgment, and it stung. She was just the cleaning lady, after all. Who was she to step into a high-stakes business negotiation? "Are you sure you're up for this?" one of the executives asked, his tone polite but tinged with disbelief. "This is a critical meeting, not a casual chat. We're talking about millions of dollars on the line. Can you really handle the pressure?" Emma's pulse quickened. She could feel their doubts swirling around her, threatening to undo her resolve. But she refused to let their dismissal break her. She had a quiet strength, a determination built over years of silently pushing through challenges. She cleaned these very rooms while listening to the whispers of high-level deals, understanding far more than anyone realized. Now, she had the chance to prove she could do more than just clean. "I'm confident I can," Emma said, her voice steadier now, though the uncertainty still lingered in the pit of her stomach. "I've been educated in this language for years. I've studied it professionally. I know the intricacies of its structure. I can help translate the contract and facilitate the meeting." Mr. Thompson folded his arms across his chest and stared at her for a moment. His eyes were cold and calculating, as though weighing the risk. His team was still murmuring amongst themselves, the tension in the room rising with each passing second. Finally, he let out a short, sharp sigh.
"Fine.
"We'll give you a chance," he said, his voice firm, though still laced with doubt. "I'll have you look at some of the documents we're using for the meeting. If you can translate them accurately, we'll bring you into the meeting tomorrow." The challenge had been set. Emma nodded, her heart beating wildly in her chest. This was it. This was the moment where she would either prove herself or be dismissed forever. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, and yet, despite the pressure, she couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. It wasn't just about the translation anymore. It was about showing them, showing herself, that she was capable of far more than they ever thought possible. The next few hours felt like an eternity. Emma sat at a small desk in the corner of the conference room, the stack of documents before her seeming to grow heavier with each passing minute. She could hear the murmurs of disbelief still echoing in the background, the skeptical comments, the whispered doubts, the disbelief that she had somehow found herself in this position. She kept her focus, though. She couldn't afford to let their doubts rattle her. Her hands, trembling slightly, picked up the first document. It was a contract, long and dense, written in the foreign language that Emma had mastered years ago. She had translated similar documents in her previous work, though it had been years since she'd done anything so formal. Her mind raced as she carefully read through the document. Every sentence, every word was familiar to her. No part of the text was beyond her understanding. She could hear the words in her mind as she translated them into English. Her fingers moved over the page, quickly but methodically, each translation more precise than the last. As she worked, she began to notice small nuances, things others would miss. There were subtle errors in the original text, minor inconsistencies that could easily be overlooked by someone not familiar with the language. They weren't glaring mistakes, but to Emma, they stood out like bright red flags. She made a mental note to address them later, but for now, she focused on the translation. Time seemed to disappear as she worked through the documents, the pages becoming a blur of text and meaning. She didn't feel the eyes of the executives on her as they watched from across the room, their skepticism turning into something else, a growing sense of wonder. She knew she was doing well, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not yet. When she finally finished the last document, she looked up. Mr. Thompson and his team were staring at her, their expressions unreadable. He stood up slowly and walked over to the table where the translated documents lay. He flipped through them, his brow furrowing as he read through the details. Emma held her breath, waiting for his verdict. After a moment, Mr. Thompson looked up at her, his expression hard to read. "This is impressive," he said slowly. "I didn't expect this." Emma felt a surge of relief wash over her. Her heart had been pounding in her chest, but now she could finally breathe. She had done it. She had proven herself. "I'll call the team in for a final review," Mr. Thompson continued, his tone still cautious, but with a hint of respect creeping in. "But you've earned a place in tomorrow's meeting." The room was still, the air charged with an uneasy anticipation. Emma sat back in her chair, trying to keep her hands steady, though she could feel the subtle tremors that came from the adrenaline of her performance. She had never imagined that a simple act of translation could change the course of her life, but here she was, on the cusp of a breakthrough that could alter everything. Mr. Thompson paced in front of her, his sharp eyes scanning the documents she had just translated. The rest of the team remained seated, silent, watching him closely. Emma couldn't tell if their expressions were skeptical or if there was a hint of awe in them, but she was too focused on Mr. Thompson to care. His opinion, more than anything, was what mattered now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stopped pacing and looked directly at Emma. His gaze was intense, considering, and for a brief moment, Emma felt a flicker of doubt. Was he going to tell her that it wasn't enough? That this wasn't her place after all? "Emma," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. "I'm not going to lie, I didn't expect this. I thought you were just the cleaning lady. But you've done more than translate these documents. You've pointed out things that even our professional translators missed." The words hit her like a wave. Emma had expected criticism, or worse, dismissal, but instead, she was hearing praise, real recognition for the first time in a long while. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She had earned this. "Tomorrow," Mr. Thompson continued, "you'll be joining us for the negotiation. If you can perform as well in the meeting as you have with these documents, we'll consider this a turning point. I'll have my team brief you on the specifics, but for now, well done." The relief that washed over Emma was overwhelming. She hadn't just done well, she had surpassed expectations. She had turned the tables. Her life was about to change, in ways she could hardly imagine. "I'll be there," Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper but firm with the certainty of her decision. The team exchanged murmurs, still processing the shift in dynamics. One of the executives, the one who had doubted her the most earlier, nodded slowly, his eyes no longer filled with skepticism but with a quiet acknowledgement of her skills. Mr. Thompson looked at Emma once more, a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval crossing his face. "I look forward to seeing what you can do, Emma." The hours leading up to the negotiation were a whirlwind for Emma. After Mr. Thompson's decision, she was given an official briefing by the team, though she could still see the flickers of doubt in their eyes. They seemed to be sizing her up, as though wondering if she could really handle the pressure of such an important meeting. A few of the colleagues, however, were beginning to warm to her. The man who had previously been the most skeptical offered her a brief nod of acknowledgement when they were discussing the specifics of the meeting. Emma couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of triumph. She was no longer just the invisible cleaning woman. She had proven her worth, and now, she was in the game. In the meantime, Mr. Thompson had arranged for her to undergo a transformation. He had someone from his personal staff bring her a professional outfit, something that might help her blend in better with the executive team. Emma was a little embarrassed at first, feeling as though she were playing dress-up. But as she stood in front of the mirror, wearing a fitted blazer and crisp blouse, she felt a strange sense of empowerment. She was no longer wearing the faded uniform she'd been known for. She was someone different now, someone with a purpose. Emma barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The clothes, the polished appearance, everything about her seemed to convey authority. It wasn't just a physical transformation, though. Emma could feel a shift inside herself. She had done something she hadn't thought possible. She had risen from the background and stepped into the light. But despite the change in appearance, the weight of the situation still loomed large. Emma had never been part of a high-level negotiation before. The stakes were enormous, and the eyes of the room would undoubtedly be on her, waiting to see if she could keep up. When she arrived at the meeting room, she found her place beside Mr. Thompson and his team. Her heart was pounding in her chest. The foreign partners were already seated, their expressions unreadable. Emma knew they didn't yet see her as a person of value, but that would change. As the meeting began, Emma held her breath, waiting for her moment to speak, to show them that she was no longer just a figure on the sidelines. The room was charged with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Emma sat in her designated spot at the long, sleek conference table, surrounded by the powerful figures of Mr. Thompson's team and the foreign partners they were negotiating with. Her heart was racing, her mind a flurry of thoughts, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. This was her moment, the opportunity of a lifetime. She couldn't afford to falter. The foreign partners were a formidable presence, their faces impassive as they exchanged a few words in their native language. Emma could hear the faint cadence of their voices, a smooth and fluid rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. It was almost as if they were speaking in a language that belonged to another world, one that she had lived in once, but had been separated from for so long. Mr. Thompson glanced over at her, his gaze a silent encouragement. His usual confidence seemed tempered by the seriousness of the moment. The negotiation was crucial, one of the most important in his career. Emma could feel the weight of his expectations resting squarely on her shoulders. She steadied her breath, calming the butterflies that fluttered inside her chest. When the foreign partners began speaking again, Emma's focus sharpened. Their words came quickly, as if they were eager to make their points. Emma didn't panic, didn't rush. Instead, she let the words sink in. She had been practicing listening, absorbing the language for years. Every word they said was a key to the puzzle she needed to solve. The translation began almost automatically. As the first sentence passed through her mind, Emma spoke with a calm precision, her voice clear and steady, carrying the words to the team at the table. Asterisk, they are requesting a 5-year contract extension with a new clause on performance-based bonuses. Asterisk, Emma translated, her eyes briefly meeting Mr. Thompson's as she spoke. Her voice was professional, measured. She could feel the weight of every word, but there was no hesitation. She was in control now. Emma's ability to convey both the literal meaning and the subtle nuance in the foreign language caught the attention of the room. The foreign partners listened intently, nodding in appreciation at her fluency and clarity. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Emma had entered a zone of pure focus, each word flowing seamlessly between languages. It was as though the room was holding its breath, waiting for her to falter. But Emma didn't. She was ready. The meeting continued, the foreign partners presenting their terms with a rapid-fire flow of language that could have overwhelmed anyone not fully immersed in the negotiation. But Emma was different. She felt like she had entered a new realm, one where her abilities and understanding of the language had seamlessly woven her into the fabric of the conversation. Her translations were spot on, every sentence delivered with the same precision as the last. Mr. Thompson and his team were watching her closely now, no longer with doubt or amusement, but with genuine respect. She wasn't just the cleaning lady anymore. She was an integral part of this critical negotiation. And with each word she spoke, that respect deepened. As Emma translated, she noticed small shifts in the foreign partner's body language. A nod here, a brief smile there, signs that they were beginning to trust her, not just as a translator, but as a skilled professional. The tension in the room was palpable, but Emma felt grounded, her focus unwavering. She could see the delicate dance of business happening before her, every word, every gesture, carefully measured. Asterisk, they are concerned about the terms of the penalty clause. Asterisk, Emma translated, her voice cutting through the murmur of discussion. Asterisk, they are asking for more flexibility in case of unforeseen circumstances. Asterisk. There was a brief silence as Mr. Thompson's team discussed the matter amongst themselves, their voices a mix of frustration and calculation. Emma held her breath, watching them debate. But as the discussion unfolded, she noticed something remarkable. The foreign partners, instead of being defensive or rigid in their stance, were open to negotiation. They respected Emma, and through her, they had come to trust the entire team. Emma had become more than a bridge between languages. She was a bridge between cultures, between two sides that needed to find common ground. When the final agreement was made, the deal was sealed with a handshake, a moment of triumph that reverberated through the room. Mr. Thompson's face softened into a rare, genuine smile, a mix of satisfaction and relief. The stakes had been high, but the negotiation had gone smoothly, all thanks to Emma's flawless translation. Emma could hardly believe it. She had not only helped seal the deal, but had made an indelible mark on Mr. Thompson and his colleagues. She had shown them her worth in ways they had never imagined. As the meeting wrapped up and the foreign partners filed out of the room, Emma remained seated, her heart still racing. She had done it. She had taken her place among the decision-makers, and for the first time, it felt like she truly belonged. As the meeting came to a close, Emma stayed in her seat, her hands resting quietly on the table in front of her. She could feel the shift in the room. The tension had melted away, replaced by a hum of satisfaction and quiet celebration. The deal had been successfully secured, and Emma, in no uncertain terms, had made herself indispensable. The team began to shuffle, gathering papers, exchanging a few words with the departing foreign partners, but no one spoke to Emma directly until Mr. Thompson walked over to her. He had a look in his eyes that Emma couldn't quite place. It was a mixture of admiration and curiosity, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Perhaps it was because, up until that very moment, he had only known her as the cleaning woman. He had never seen her as more than that. But now, after witnessing her skill and professionalism in action, it was clear he had underestimated her. "Emma," he began, his voice softer now, more respectful than before, "I have to say I'm impressed." She met his gaze, feeling a strange sense of pride welling up inside her. She had worked so hard to make a name for herself, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined it would happen like this. Her journey from the corners of the building to the center of a high-stakes business negotiation seemed surreal. "I don't mean to pry," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice thoughtful, "but you said you could translate. And you did that beyond what I imagined. But how did you learn it?" Emma hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much she should reveal. Her past was something she didn't often talk about. It was too personal, too full of old wounds. But now, with Mr. Thompson's genuine curiosity in his eyes, she felt a small spark of trust forming. It wasn't about the job she did or the role she played now. It was about who she was. "Well," Emma began slowly, choosing her words carefully, "I was once a translator. I worked in the field professionally before. Well, life got complicated. I had a family to care for, and things didn't go the way I'd hoped. Eventually, I found myself cleaning to make ends meet. It wasn't what I'd planned, but it's where I ended up." She looked down, avoiding his gaze for a moment. Her story wasn't one of triumph. It was a quiet, painful tale of sacrifice and survival. But in that moment, she allowed herself to say the truth. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, his expression now soft with empathy. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "I never would have guessed." Mr. Thompson stood there, absorbing Emma's words. For a brief moment, the weight of the story hung between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the complexities that lay behind her humble exterior. He was struck not only by the depth of her past, but also by the stark contrast between the woman before him now, confident, poised, and undeniably capable, and the image he had held of her just hours ago. He had seen her as nothing more than a background figure, a part of the scenery in a sleek, high-powered office. Just another employee in a sea of invisible faces. But now, after witnessing her brilliance in action, everything had changed. Emma wasn't just a cleaner. She was a woman of talent, of ambition, of untapped potential. A woman who had been overlooked, underestimated, and yet had risen, unflinchingly, to meet an opportunity that would change her life. "I never would have imagined," Mr. Thompson said softly, almost to himself, as if he were processing the weight of the truth. "You've done more than just help us with translation. You've saved the deal. And all this time, I've barely noticed you." Emma shrugged, her voice quieter now. "I'm used to it. People don't look twice at someone like me." The word stung more than she cared to admit. There was no bitterness in her tone, no anger, only the quiet resignation of someone who had long accepted the way the world saw her. But she wasn't angry anymore. If anything, there was a quiet strength in her now. She had earned the right to be seen, to be heard. Mr. Thompson's gaze softened. He looked down at her, no longer seeing her as the cleaning lady, but as someone who had proven her worth in the most extraordinary way. There was a flicker of guilt in his eyes, quickly hidden beneath his professional demeanor, but it was there. He realized now that he had judged her based on her role, rather than her skills. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice sincere. "I should have noticed you sooner. You've got a lot more to offer than I ever imagined." Emma met his eyes, a brief, fleeting smile curving her lips. It was the kind of smile that acknowledged the unspoken change that had just taken place between them. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about understanding. "Thank you," she replied simply. There was no need for more words. In that moment, Emma knew that she had proven herself. Not just to Mr. Thompson, but to herself as well. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, and no one, least of all him, would ever overlook her again. As the days following the successful negotiation passed, Emma found herself still processing the whirlwind of changes that had come her way. It was hard to believe how much had shifted in such a short time. What had begun as a routine day at work, scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins, had turned into an unforgettable journey that had brought her into the heart of a high-stakes business deal. Her newfound status as the woman who saved the day hadn't gone unnoticed. Word had spread quickly through Mr. Thompson's company. The team that had once doubted her was now singing her praises, offering her nods of recognition and sometimes even a few words of thanks. But it was Mr. Thompson's actions that truly caught her attention. After the meeting, he had invited her to join him in his office, a rare gesture that made Emma feel both humbled and awkward. The corner office was the epitome of luxury, with panoramic windows overlooking the city skyline and shelves lined with books that spoke of wealth, influence, and status. And yet, as she stood there, she didn't feel out of place. It was almost as though the office was now a space where she, too, belonged. "Emma," Mr. Thompson began, his voice serious but warm. "I've been thinking about what you did for us, the way you stepped in and handled that negotiation. It wasn't just your language skills. It was your presence, your ability to manage the room, to keep calm under pressure. I was wrong to underestimate you." She nodded, unsure of what to say. It was still surreal to her, how everything had turned around so quickly. "I've got a proposition for you," he continued. "There's an opening in our international relations department. We need someone who can bridge cultural gaps, someone who understands the nuances of language, but also knows how to communicate effectively in high-stakes environments. Someone like you." Emma's breath caught in her throat. A job offer. An official one. It was a far cry from the life she had led just a few weeks ago. The salary, the status, everything about this offer seemed so foreign to her, so unreachable just a short time ago. And yet here it was, right in front of her. "I don't know if I'm qualified," she said hesitantly, the doubt creeping in. "I've been out of that world for so long. I don't know if I could." "You are qualified," Mr. Thompson cut in gently. "I've seen it with my own eyes. You don't need to doubt yourself anymore." The weight of the offer hung between them, heavy with the promise of a future that was no longer bound by her past. Emma stood silently for a moment, absorbing Mr. Thompson's words. The room felt impossibly still, as though the world outside had paused in anticipation of her decision. Her thoughts raced, her mind caught in a whirlwind of uncertainty and possibility. Could she really leave her old life behind? Could she trust that this new opportunity, this world she had never imagined she would be part of, was real? It wasn't the offer itself that made her hesitate. It was the fear of change, of stepping into a life that was so different from the one she had known. For so many years, Emma had lived simply. She had kept her head down, focused on surviving, taking care of her family, and doing what needed to be done to make ends meet. Her life had been humble, but it had been hers. It had been safe. But now? Now, things were different. She wasn't just a cleaner. She wasn't just someone who swept the floors and emptied the trash. She was someone with a skill set that others valued, someone whose talents had been recognized, someone who had proven her worth. And yet, with that recognition came the weight of responsibility, the pressure to perform, to succeed in a world that felt intimidating, unfamiliar. "I'll need some time to think about it," Emma said, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "It's a big decision. I've been in this role for a long time, and leaving it, well, it's not something I can just do on a whim." Mr. Thompson nodded, understanding. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But just know that the offer is there. It's yours if you want it." Emma walked out of his office later that afternoon, the weight of the decision still heavy on her shoulders. She couldn't help but replay the conversation over and over in her mind. A part of her felt excited, eager even, to step into this new world. But another part of her, one that had grown accustomed to the stability of her current life, felt a deep sense of apprehension. That night, Emma sat at her kitchen table, the familiar hum of the city outside her window. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she wrapped them around a warm cup of tea. She thought of her family, of how far she had come to support them, to give them a better life. She had always been the caretaker, the one who put everyone else first. Could she afford to put herself first now? She didn't have an answer yet, but she knew one thing. This was a turning point. One way or another, she had to decide. The days that followed Emma's conversation with Mr. Thompson were filled with quiet contemplation. She spent her time weighing the offer, considering every possible outcome. Yet, amid the internal tug-of-war over her future, there was one thing she hadn't expected: the subtle shift in her relationship with Mr. Thompson. At first, Emma had been convinced that the businessman saw her only as an employee, an instrumental, yet unimportant part of the machinery that kept the office running. But after the negotiation, after all the praise and the respectful acknowledgement of her skills, something changed. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that could be defined clearly or easily. It was in the small moments. The way he looked at her now, a little longer than before, as though seeing her for the first time. The gentle tone in his voice when he spoke to her, a contrast to the businesslike indifference he had shown in the past. There was also the way he asked about her day, genuinely interested, his eyes not just scanning the room, but truly focusing on her words. She had never expected him to be so warm, so personable. Mr. Thompson had always seemed distant, a man of business first and foremost. But now it seemed that there was more to him, a softer side, one that wasn't just about the deal, the negotiation, the money. Emma noticed this subtle shift in the way he interacted with her. At first, she chalked it up to her newfound role in the company, thinking that his change in demeanor was simply a result of her professional success. But over time, she began to realize that it was something more. It was a personal interest, a flicker of admiration, maybe even something deeper. One afternoon, as she was preparing to leave the office for the day, Mr. Thompson lingered at his desk. He caught her eye as she stood up, the briefest of smiles tugging at the corner of his lips. "Emma," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I just wanted to thank you again. You've done more for this company than anyone could have expected." She smiled back, feeling a warmth that wasn't just from his words, but from something unspoken between them. "I was just doing my job," she replied, but even as she said it, she knew it was more than that. She had made an impact, and not just in business, but in the way Mr. Thompson now saw her. After days of thought, self-reflection, and quiet conversations with those closest to her, Emma finally knew what she had to do. The world she had known, the one filled with routine and simplicity, was a part of her past now. She had fought for a better life, and now a better life was within her reach. It wasn't an easy choice. Saying goodbye to the cleaning job, to the familiarity of her work, and to the comfort of living a life on her own terms was daunting. But Emma had grown in ways she hadn't expected. The woman who had once shuffled unnoticed in the background, the one who hid behind the mop and bucket, had stepped into a new role. She had proven her worth, not just to Mr. Thompson or the company, but to herself. When she walked into the office the following week, it felt different. The once cold, polished floors seemed less intimidating now, as though they were a part of her, a reflection of her journey. As she walked through the door, her name was called with respect. People greeted her with a nod, an acknowledgement of her new role, and for the first time in a long while, Emma felt the weight of their recognition. But it wasn't just her colleagues who treated her differently. Mr. Thompson had continued to extend small gestures of kindness, genuine smiles, moments of quiet conversation, and words of encouragement. She had noticed the subtle shift in him too, the way he no longer just saw her as an employee, but as an equal, someone he could rely on not only for professional matters but for her insight and her opinions. And so, Emma began her new role in the company's international relations department. The transition was not without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, moments when she questioned her place in this new world. But with every passing day, her confidence grew. She was learning, adapting, and thriving. The same woman who had once worried she was not enough was now becoming someone others relied on. In the quiet of the evening, as she looked out at the city's skyline from her office, Emma allowed herself to smile. She had stepped into the future she once only dreamed of, and it felt right. Whatever was next, she was ready. Her journey wasn't just about making a name for herself. It was about proving that the quiet, humble people are just as capable of greatness as anyone else. And Emma had done just that.